Well, good morning, and welcome to one and all to the Atlantic Council. My name is Fred Hoff, and I'm the director of the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. My predecessor, Ambassador Frank Ricciardoni, decided last year that the Hariri Center needed real Turkish expertise, that the days of defining Turkey's orientation in exclusively northern and western azimuths were gone and likely never to return. Near the top of a long list of good things Frank Ricciardoni did for the Hariri Center was the recruitment of Aaron Stein to build and lead a first-rate Turkish practice here within the Atlantic Council. Recent events in Turkey have substantiated Frank's prescience. Aaron's analysis in our MENA Source blog and elsewhere has attracted favorable reviews around the world for accuracy, fairness, and relevance. In addition to his superb grasp of Turkish politics, Aaron knows a lot about the Kurdish YPG in northern Syria and has collaborated with Faisal Litani of the Hariri Center to shed light on complex interactions between the YPG, American ground and air forces, ISIS, Turkey, Russia, the Syrian opposition, the Arab tribes of eastern Syria, and the Assad regime. Today, Aaron will moderate a discussion on the broad question of where Turkey may be headed in the wake of the failed coup. Aaron will introduce the other panelists, but I'd be remiss in not thanking Elmira Berasli and Steve Cook for joining us, two tremendous experts. Everyone in this room is mindful, I think, that the current situation in Turkey gives rise to issues and questions that are contentious and controversial. We would all agree, I think, that an important American ally is undergoing some profound trauma. We would all agree, I think, that the failure of the coup attempt is a profoundly good thing. There is much, however, about which to debate and disagree over Turkey's situation and its direction. Here at the Atlantic Council, civility and good manners, especially in the context of differing points of view, are highly valued. We ask that all of our guests today respect the wishes of their host in this regard. Delighted today to have C-SPAN covering this event. And for those of you who would like to join the conversation via Twitter, feel free to submit questions using @ACMidEast with the hashtag ACTurkey. Thank you all again very much for joining us today. Aaron, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Fred, for that wonderful introduction, for our two panelists for coming. Obviously, I think the events in Turkey last Friday and then extending up until today have been something that we've all been watching very closely, and I think the number of attendees points to the amount of interest going on inside Turkey. So I hope we have a very good discussion today. We're going to do this more like a question and answer or conversational format up here. And so obviously I want to introduce my panelists first, starting on the left, which is Stephen Cook, who is a senior fellow for the Middle East and North Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Almira Bayrasli, visiting fellow at the New America Foundation and the co-founder of Foreign Policy Interrupted. So I want to begin just by asking a broad question. What took place in Turkey last Friday and Saturday, and what has been taking place in Turkey since then, up until right now?
presume that's to me, Aaron, since you're looking directly at me. First, let me just thank Fred Hoff and Aaron, you for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here with my good friend Elmira as well. It certainly has been an extraordinary 10 days in Turkey. I must say that there's a connection here. I was working away on Friday afternoon, July 15th, looking forward to a nice quiet weekend when my phone went off and it was a text from Aaron that said, I think there is a coup in Turkey. And I immediately switched to Twitter and the wire services, and I texted back, I think you may be correct. And we were off and running. Then. What has happened and what is happening? Let me just start out by saying, from my own perspective, at that moment I had a number, that Aaron texted, I had a number of questions about whether this was actually a coup and how effective it could possibly be. And it's easy in hindsight, but it strikes me that there's four reasons why the coup is not successful. And let me just run through them very quickly before I talk about what I think is happening now. First, it's clear that the Turkish military is divided. Now, we didn't have a lot of insight into that prior to this event, but one could have, understanding the way in which the Justice and Development Party has sought since 2007 to establish control over the military, that it was absolutely plausible that there would that splits within the military would occur. In the period between 2003 and 2005, for those of you who are civil military relations geeks, the Turks sought objective control of the military. That is to subordinate the military to the political institutions of the Turkish state, which is a healthy way of establishing civilian control over the officers. Since 2007, 2008, the wildly controversial Ergenekon and sledgehammer cases, there's been a different mode of establishing civilian control, and that's what Samuel Huntington called subjective control, which carries risks with it, and the risks are creating splits and fissures and loyalties within the military that didn't exist there before. I think that is, in part, the story, and one that has gone unreported. I think the second reason it failed is that because President Erdogan has been in power since 2003. After 13 and a half years, he certainly has the place wired. It's not surprising to me that he was tipped off that something was underway. And the fact that he was able to be tipped off was a function of the fact that the military was divided on this. It was not a unified thing, although it was a larger coup than we initially suspect, a larger coup attempt than we initially suspected. Pardon me. Third big reason is that the Turkish military is politically weak and has been politically weak for some time. Anytime you read in something, whether it's a paper, a book, a newspaper, a journal article, whatever, and say the powerful or the all-powerful Turkish military, just set it aside. That has been a perspective, but I think the fact that the military has had to intervene in 4 coups over the course of 4 decades, and then a variety of other kinds of interventions, the fact that the military had to be placed in specific monitoring positions throughout Turkish society would suggest that the wellspring, the political basis of the military support is not what we had seen, and that it has been extraordinarily difficult for the military to keep politics within a certain acceptable band for them. And then I think the most important thing, and something that I've emphasized in my writing since the failed coup attempt, is quite clearly the Turkish public did not accept the military intervention. Not only were supporters of President Erdogan out in the streets opposing this, but so were a large number of people who are opponents of the Justice and Development Party and opponents of President Erdogan. And I think the baseline for this, if we look back to 2007 when the military tried to prevent Fethullah Gulen from becoming the president, there were large protests then in which Turks expressed that they did not want to live in a religious state and they did not want to live under military rule or a military state. And I think that reflects a changing Turkish society, one that is no longer willing to accept military rule. And as Fred pointed out, I think that that's very, very good news. Now, what's happening, we can talk about in more detail, but I think what's clear is that a widespread crackdown is happening. I think that the Turkish government has discovered a narrative that helps advance their political agenda. I'm perfectly willing to believe that the people that they have fingered for the coup may or may not be responsible, but I'm not willing to draw any conclusions until anybody produces solid evidence of it. And I think what we should do is situate both the failed coup and the response to it in a broader arc of Turkish politics over the course of the better part of the last decade, which is after some very hopeful signs of liberalization and an invitation to formally begin EU negotiations, we have seen, if this is a word, reauthoritarianization of Turkey. I like to think that I coined it, but it's too awkward to actually coin that term. But a reauthoritarianization of Turkey. And this is something that has been going on not since last Saturday, but since 2007 and 2008. We can talk in more detail, but I don't want to take up all the time.
Please, do you want to pick up where Stephen left off?
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Land Council, Aaron. I'm going to dovetail on Stephen. We coordinated this a little bit. And I just want to make three points. I think there's an internal aspect to this, there's an external aspect, and there's a legacy aspect. One, I think internally, and each has good news and bad news. So there's two sides of the coin. Not all is lost. Starting with the good news, I think internally, Turkey over the past 2 decades has really advanced economically. It went from, being this backwater that I remember going to as a child to being the 16th largest economy in the world. Turkey's GDP is $800 billion. Extreme poverty has been reduced in Turkey from 13% to 4.5%. Over the past 10 years, 6.3 million jobs have been created in Turkey. 40% of the population has moved into the middle class. And I think that's very significant because when you have all of this very good progress, it wasn't matched by the growth of the politics in the society. And so you have this social mobility and this social movement, but I think, as Stephen said, Turkey's political system has not advanced since 1960s, 70s, 80s, and all these incidents that you've had. And essentially, you have a very weak opposition, you have very weak state institutions, and you do have a weak rule of law. And I think what you're starting to see is a society that did come out on the evening of July 15th because they don't want to live under a military rule, but they want their voices heard. And I think that I think it's important to take a look at why people attempted the coup. I read something in the Washington Post this morning that the Early Warning Project only said it was 2.5% that Turkey would have had a coup. And I certainly was among those people that poo-pooed any notion that the military would come back again. But I think that there are very few outlets for expression in Turkey, and I think that people are frustrated that there is not a viable opposition in Turkey. I think looking externally, I think start with the good news. Again, EU accession. I think the pull for Turkey to want to be a member of the EU has really advanced the country. It's led to a lot of progress that we've seen over the last 2 decades. But when you look at Turkey's geography, and as much as Turkey wants to look to the EU, to Brussels, and to the West, it's also in a really bad neighborhood. And I think that the events that have unfolded over the past 2 decades in Turkey, not only in Syria most recently, but in Iraq, have had a profound effect on Turkey. And I think it is one of the reasons, I think it's a dynamic, in addition to what's been happening internally, where Turkey stands externally in terms of Europe and Washington. And that's not entirely, and I don't want to put all the blame on Ankara here. I think that there are policy missteps that Washington has taken that has created an atmosphere where I think Turkey has, where Erdogan essentially has been able to take the lead on a number of issues and position himself in a position of power. The third point, I think, is legacy. And I say legacy and not history, mainly because I'm not a let's dwell on the past, let's move on. But history, it's like these data points where you want to take a look. And I think what's more important to hear to understand is that when you're looking at the past coups in Turkey and the Turkish history, whether it be in 1960, 71, in 80, and 97, you have this sense that someone's going to come in and someone's going to fix this, and people are not there's this great fear and mistrust that has been created as a result of that. And when you have this imbalance where you have great economic prosperity and you have this social mobility, but you're not matching it with the political and social advancement, it's just a cocktail for chaos. I think just in terms of takeaways, I think someone asked me, will Turkey survive? And I think, yes, Turkey will survive. I think Turkey has had harder days in the past. I think we've certainly been witness to that. I think the question is what kind of a Turkey will come out of this. I think there are very tough days ahead, and I don't mean to say that just as a cliche talking point. I think you're going to have to take a look at what the government's going to do, and I agree with what Stephen said in terms of the narrative being very anti-Western and very vituperative. But I think Erdogan and the Turkish government are also going to have to balance power and governance. We have to remember that the AKP came to power because they could govern. They were a bunch of technocrats, and they delivered. I remember Istanbul as a child going to Turkey in the 70s and 80s, and it was not the city that it is today. And Erdogan turned that around, and the AKP were a bunch of technocrats that delivered. And they've garnered power in the 2002 election, they won in 2007, and then 2011 they won by 49% of the popular vote because they delivered services. And I think the question right now is, are they going to choose power over governance? Because while I think externally, I think the power does play into what Ankara wants to do. I think there's also an element of if you don't continue to deliver the services and things for the Turkish public, you are going to get a backlash. And I can talk about just my sentiments that I've had in there. And I think just in terms of U.S.-Turkey relations, I think unfortunately, we're going to see a lot of rocky road ahead, but I'm sure that we'll talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Sure. And thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen and Elmira, for the brief intro there. And I wanted to pick up on something that you both touched on and that we didn't get into much in the opening statements. You said, is that from the outset, as the events were taking place last Friday and sort of into Saturday, is that almost immediately the Turkish government began to point the finger at one person who lives up in Pennsylvania, Fethullah Gulen, as being the instigator of the coup and being largely behind it. Now, obviously, this has spillover implications for U.S.-Turkey relations because of his status here in the United States. So I just want to begin there. Can either one of you take a shot at explaining to the audience who Fethullah Gulen is, and then the implications of his status, his purported role in the coup, the attempted coup, and then what that could broadly more mean for U.S.-Turkey relations?
I nominate Elmira to start.
Sure. I think there's a lot being bandied about who Fethullah Gulen is, and a lot of it is cult and secrecy, and he's this Muslim cleric that lives in the Poconos in Pennsylvania. He leads a movement called Hizmet. It is, for the most part, it's this Sufi-like, very peace-loving movement that is very Islamic oriented. And I think to begin with, I think Hizmet and the AKP were once allies when the AKP and Erdogan first came to power in 2002. And they were very much in alliance. One of the things that Gulen has done here in the United States with his Hizmet movement is he has a number of charter schools around the country, but he also does a lot of very pro-democracy, pro-peace activism. And when I say that, that doesn't mean that I support the organization or the individual. I think I'm putting that into context because I think one of the unfortunate things in Turkey is that everything gets painted in black and white. And I actually had to say this on Twitter because you either get painted in one camp or the other. Look, facts are facts, and that's the name of his organization, and that's what they have, proclaim what their organization stands for.
Let me just add that, as I stated in my opening remarks, clearly the Turkish government has a political interest in framing the narrative that the Gulenists were behind this and that Fethullah Gulen himself somehow coordinated or ordered this failed coup attempt. I think that we should be open-minded about who's responsible and how this went about. But the Turkish government is merely interested in making the assertion that the Gulenists are responsible without actually offering the evidence. If you look at what the Turkish government has produced thus far, that at least has been made publicly, there isn't anything beyond these assertions. There will, of course, be an effort on the part of the government to pressure the United States on extraditing Fethullah Gulen, but they're going to have to produce evidence. And like I said, I'm perfectly willing to believe that there were Gulenists involved in the coup attempt, but until the government provides that evidence, it's very hard for the United States to act upon it. Let me, and without repeating everything that Almira just said, let me point out that there was this cooperation and working in parallel between the Gulen movement and the AKP. They cooperated in trying to bring the military to heel. There was a falling out between the two in 2013, and what we have seen since then and what we are seeing now is the kind of high-stakes political struggles that often go on in political systems, particularly authoritarian political systems. President Erdogan, who has become the sun around which all Turkish politics revolves, the Justice and Development Party has become an expression and a vehicle for his unbounded ambition and his transformative vision of Turkish society, cannot tolerate another charismatic, influential, politically powerful center of power in Turkish politics, whether it is based out of Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania, or in Istanbul and Ankara. And that is why we are seeing the government take the dramatic actions that it has taken since the coup, whether Gulenists were involved or not. And let me say again, I'm perfectly willing to believe that Gulenists were involved, but it's clear that the government is making an opportunity out of the failed coup to finally, as they have said, pull out the roots of the Gulenist movement. A lot of people are going to be caught up in this, and it's going to be an extraordinarily difficult and violent moment in Turkish politics as a result.
And I just want to add to that. I also think that it's important to note, the Gulenists are also, I don't know how to say this diplomatically. The Gulenists, when they were allies with the AKP, also really contributed to, crushing out, opposition voices. They were very much involved in trying to remove a lot of the military from government elements and taking over the police force. And so while, I don't buy into these rumors about, who's responsible, are the Gulenists part of the coup? Maybe they are. I mean, I think that there needs to be evidence, but I also have to say, I don't think that they're a completely innocent organization. I think that it is an organization that bears a lot of culpability for a lot of the chaos that is going on in Turkey.
Well, one of the problems with the Gulen movement is the lack of transparency.
Yes.
And that raises a whole host of questions about what it is their ultimate goals are. I think it's pretty clear that the Gulenists have, over a period of time, placed their activists and followers within the bureaucracy and sought to, there's my New York accent coming out, and sought to direct state resources to their favored and preferred activities and operations. But every Turkish political party and movement has done that over a period of time. I think the Gulenists have been, again, the lack of transparency with them has raised a whole host of very important questions about what their role is and what their ultimate goals are.
If I can just jump in here and take the moderator's prerogative. It sounds like conspiracy to an American audience. It's this idea that this man living in Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania, instructs his followers to infiltrate Turkish institutions with the sort of longer-term goal of remaking the state in the way that he sees fit for his own political objectives. Now, I wanted to pick up on something there because you both mentioned that there was, at the outset of AKP rule, a harmonization, I would say, between the longer-term ambitions of the Gulen, the shorter-term ambitions of the AKP to protect itself from the very attempted coup that took place on Friday and Saturday, and the longer-term ambitions of the Gulenists, which is to be legitimized and recognized within all aspects of the Turkish bureaucracy, including the military. So I'm curious to see, to flesh out your thoughts a little bit more on did the AKP's efforts to coup-proof the system, with Ergenekon and Balyoz being the most obvious sort of manifestations of that, contribute to the attempted coup that took place last Saturday? And then the concentric circles that are going around in this roundup of people who are allegedly part of the Gulen movement, is what longer-term implications are there for the Turkish state, the bureaucracy, and the military as well? Maybe Stephen, you want to start first?
I'll answer the first part of your question very quickly, and I think I alluded to it in my opening remarks, and that is that as a result of the Ergenekon and Sledgehammer cases, which were these cases that began in 2007, was Ergenekon and Sledgehammer in 2010, which were these spectacular cases against military officers accused of plotting against the state, created an environment where you did or risked fissures and splits within the Turkish armed forces. And I think that those splits and fissures came out very clearly in Friday and Saturday. I would not have predicted what happened on Friday and Saturday, but I was aware, and I think we all should have been aware of the fact that the way in which the AKP went about trying to, with the help of the Gulenists, I should add, trying to subordinate the military, did contribute to an environment where something like Friday and Saturday could happen. Now, I think your question is, what do the purges of the Gulenists mean for the efficacy of the Turkish state, and the fact that whether the Turkish state can run without Gulenists? Because we know how many people have been rounded up, whether Gulenists or not. And I think, and let me just talk about the things that we're most concerned about here in Washington, D.C., which is, can the Turkish military, can Turkish police, can Turkish intelligence control the borders with Syria? Can they conduct operations with the United States? Can they work with the United States and its allies at Incirlik Air Base? And I think we have to raise questions about whether that is possible. Not because the Turks may not want to, but because they clearly don't have the capacity. If you are cashiering thousands of officers, if you are dismissing tens of thousands of people all the time, with the country focused in on itself, a military that is in chaos, a police force, a national police force, a Ministry of Interior that has been decimated by purges, one has to wonder whether Turkey can be an effective partner of the United States, whether they can actually run this government. Just aside from the security issues, dismissing 20,000+ teachers, where are they going to find qualified people to do this? How is it that they have a blanket order that academics cannot travel? They have dismissed 1,500 rectors of universities. This is going to have a profound impact on Turkish society in important ways that I think will be felt for quite some time. This is a purge on the order of the purge after the 1980 coup d'etat, in which the military stayed in power for 3 years. So let me underline and emphasize what Elmira was saying about the troubled days ahead for Turkey. And I think that we should think about Turkey as a manifestly unstable country right now. They have a war with the PKK. They have experienced at least 11 terrorist attacks, 6 of which can be traced to the Islamic State. That's separating out all of the PKK violence. They have a military that is essentially in chaos, and a purge underway which is undermining the capacity and effectiveness of the Turkish state. That's, to my mind, an unstable country.
I don't really much have to add to that, but I think to underline the point that Stephen made, I think this comes down to a question of governance and purging all of those people not from public service. There were a number of people dismissed from the foreign ministry today, and the teachers. I think that there's a question of where are you going to find the qualified people, individuals to fulfill those positions, but there's an economic cost here too. And I don't know what the numbers are, but I can imagine that this coup has cost Turkey billions of dollars. I mean, just in terms of the military, the dismissals, and the aftermath that you're going to have. And I think it's a question of, again, there's a grab for power here, but I think what Turkey really needs is governance right now. And then just going to the point of, the Gulenists or the AKP and these various factions. I think what Turkey is also suffering from is this legacy of democracy by majority. and it's majoritarianism, and it's never been about the individual and individual freedoms and rights. And until we can get to a place where people can feel like they can have whatever belief and expression that they want and not feel like they have to belong to one group or the other, I think, I'm not as, and you can maybe call me Pollyannish, I'm not as down on Turkey because I take a look at the economics in the startup world. And so I spend a lot of time with entrepreneurs who are creating and investments. Abraj Capital today announced $526 million investment. They created a fund, and I know this week another Silicon Valley-based fund will announce another fund that will go into investing in Turkey. And so I just think looking at it from that perspective, I think Turkey has evolved since the 1980s, but I also think that until it can actually really get to a place where institutions and the rule of law is respected, I think you're still going to see trouble ahead.
If I can just pick up and maybe challenge, you, Stephen, on something, is that, in the days since, where these actions have been taken against suspected Gulenists and the bureaucracy, the focus in the West has been on the purges. But when you talk to Turks, I find very few are weeping over what is coming towards the Gulenist ways, because there's a lot of people feel like they are getting what is deserved of them. I like to joke that they have higher unfavorable ratings than Donald Trump. Nobody in Turkey likes the Gulenist movement. And so you have unity, perhaps maybe some, let's say, discomfort from some of the main opposition parties, but you largely have unity since the coup, a failed coup, about what the AKP is carrying out. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that, about the sort of the political space afforded to the government to carry these things out?
Right, and I've had the same thing. In fact, a spirited email exchange with one of my friends from college, who is a Turk who lives in Istanbul, who said essentially, well, the Gulenists, I don't really care. And not to besmirch the fine reputation of one of my buddies from college, I think that this speaks exactly to what Elmira is talking about in terms of this majoritarian view, this kind of illiberal view of politics and of democracy in Turkey. It is true that Turkey has elections. It's true that President Erdogan won 52% of the vote in his presidential election in 2014. But by no means can we think of Turkey as a democracy, and I don't think we can say for certain that Turkish society itself has kind of embraced the norms and principles of liberal democracy, and those kinds of things that these people have had it coming to them. It's the same kind of attitude when the AKP and the Gulenists were cooperating to do in journalists who were critical of them early on in the AKP's tenure. That it is not, there isn't a sense of a rule of law and the equal application of law. It's getting after whomever is the villain of the moment. That, to me, suggests that this is a society that is going to have a very hard time coming together after this trauma. Where does this purge begin and where does it end? We've seen this kind of thing in other settings as well. Let me point out also that the narrative that I've heard from any number of Turkish friends over the course of the last week is that this is justified because we're saving democracy. It's hard to make the argument that Turkey is a democracy. As I said, there's been elections, there's been a vast array of coalition governments, there have been free and regularly scheduled elections since the 1940s. But let's talk about just this government at this moment. This government is a function of a rerun election from November of last fall because President Erdogan did not like the outcome of the June elections in which the AKP lost its parliamentary majority. And he manipulated the political institutions of the Turkish state in order to make it impossible for there to be a coalition government, run out the clock so that the then Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, who, by the way, was pushed from power by President Erdogan, a power that President Erdogan does not have, and they would have rerun elections in November, and they gained back all of the votes that they lost in the June elections. It's hard for me to conclude under those circumstances, given what's happened and what's happened previously, that the AKP is saving anything other than the institutionalization of its own power at the expense of democratic ideals and liberal ideals.
I think that picking up on the point of the November, the re-election.
The redo?
The redo election in November. I think that what we saw leading up to that was an atmosphere of fear that was created. And I think, unfortunately, the purges are also creating this atmosphere of fear, which really Turkey does not need. I think this is already a society that had a low level of trust among individuals. You already have, again, I keep repeating it, weak rule of law and weak institutions. But this atmosphere of fear, I mean, I've talked to lots of people in Turkey, and they're all afraid to express their opinions. And I know that people came out in the name of democracy on July 15th, but the Gezi protesters who were beaten back in 2013, a lot of them will not come back out. You have journalists being jailed and silenced. And I actually think, you have the firing of all of these teachers and academics. I think you're going to start to see a rollback. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a clampdown on a lot of NGOs, particularly Western international NGOs in Turkey. And I think there's a real atmosphere of fear where people are afraid to express themselves. And when you live in an environment like that, you cannot have progress. And this is what actually scares me in Turkey.
That's a rather bleak note, I think, from both of you about the current state of the country. So I'd actually like to flip to something that a lot of people are discussing, honestly, from right at the outset when this thing looked like it was going to fail, was the status of President Erdogan. And there's a lot of talk that his position has been strengthened because of this, because of sort of all of the resulting moves. But there's also a counter narrative to that no, this is a country that just underwent significant trauma, and that it was a failed coup attempt. And so while he may have some more room to politically maneuver, he's presiding over a system that underwent a failed coup attempt that had pretty wide buy-in support from a lot of factions in the military. I'm interested to hear both of your thoughts on these conflicting narratives. What is the status of Turkey's president, the most important politician, following the failed coup?
I think Erdogan is both weak and strong. I certainly think the way that people came out on July 15th and stood up against the military coup, the way that he called out and his supporters, and again, Erdogan is he's a popularly elected individual, and there are 50% of Turks do support Erdogan and Erdogan's policies. So he is profoundly successful. And so I think he has grabbed a lot of power, and certainly the purges and replacing them with individuals who are supposedly loyal to him. I don't know how you actually gauge that, but will certainly strengthen him. But I think what has happened has weakened Turkey, and that's what makes Erdogan weak. You're a strong man of a weak country, and I don't know what that really means. I think there's a tragedy here. And I think the tragedy is that, Erdogan in 2002 and 2003, when he became prime minister, talked a different talk. He talked about inclusion. He talked about minority rights. He talked about representing Turks regardless of who they were. He was the first Turkish leader to actually sit down with the Kurds. He got Turkey closer to European accession, closer than any other Turkish leader before that. And I think what the tragedy here is today is that I feel like he's just taken it back to the 20th century and negated all of the gains that he had come into and started out in office with.
I have just absolutely tremendous admiration for President Erdogan. I think his political skills are unrivaled. I have had the opportunity to be up and close to him a number of times over the course of my career, and I have to say he's an extraordinarily charismatic person, and his political skills, even in non-Turkish speaking audiences, come through. He is, think about it, he's better than Bill Clinton. Yeah. He makes Bill Clinton look like a jumble of nerves and not charismatic. His ability to kind of hone in and understand what Turks feel and believe and hope and want is rather extraordinary, and the kind of personal story that he has been able to advance really helps politically. All that being said, I agree with Elmira. He is strong, and he's strong for those reasons that I pointed out. And he's won a presidential election with more than 50% of the vote. But he's also quite weak. Let's keep in mind that the AKP has never surpassed 50% of the vote. And Erdogan governs half the country that supports him and intimidates the rest and uses coercive measures against the rest. And if we see post-Gezi Park protests, what's happened over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, post-failed coup, that if Erdogan felt as confident in that his vision for Turkish society was as broadly shared, was common sense, was embedded in the minds of Turks as something that's natural, he wouldn't necessarily have to use the kinds of measures that he's used. He wouldn't have to be intimidating his opponents. It would not matter because he would have the country. But I remember around the time of Gezi, I was in Turkey and calling out 400,000 people to reaffirm how much they loved Tayyip Erdogan struck me as an inherently weak thing that you had to do. Yes, 400,000 people came out, and my Turkish friends who were not supporters of Erdogan saying, well, they used the Istanbul buses to get people there was meaningless. There were 400,000 people, but the fact that they actually had to do that suggested to me that all was not well, and that there was a sense of vulnerability, that there was a need to reaffirm how important then Prime Minister Erdogan is and how important the Justice and Development parties. I have to say that rally was outstanding. I purchased a Recep Tayyip Erdogan T-shirt and carpet during it, which have come to great use over the course of the last week.
Something that you just said. I think there is vulnerability within the AKP, and I think that's right, because after when Gezi was happening, everybody was focused in on Istanbul naturally because that's where a lot of the heart of the protests were, and Ankara. But I flew to Kayseri, which is kind of like the AKP. That's the mothership. And it's this conservative town in the middle of Anatolia, and I wanted to see what was happening. What was happening in the middle of Anatolia. And there, where AKP dominates, and they have this beautiful building in downtown Kayseri, I actually came across a number of AKP supporters who actually expressed their disdain for Erdogan and complaining that Erdogan had sold out the country and that he sold it to people in the Middle East, and that Turks don't own anything anymore, and that and this one woman said something, reminiscent of the Ronald Reagan, am I better off, now than I was 4 years ago? And she said, I'm not better off, and I am worried about my future. But when I asked her, would she continue to support Erdogan and the AKP, she said, I don't have a choice because the opposition doesn't represent my views. And so I actually do think that there is a vulnerability within the AKP. I don't think that a lot of these people are big Erdogan supporters, but I also think because the opposition is so weak, and I think one of the reasons calling out these supporters is, again, it's the natural clutch, the legacy of let's go back to nationalism, let's wave around the Star and Crescent flag, and create this image where we have to go out and rally behind the flag.
You obviously paint a picture of a complicated society, and I always joke, at least a very wise Turkey analyst who showed me around when I was even younger, living in Istanbul at the time, that in order to really understand Turkey, you have to leave Istanbul and spend a lot of time out in small villages where to understand what gets people out to vote. We've been focusing really narrowly on sort of the coup attempt and Erdogan. I want to broaden it out because we touched on it before we turn to the audience for a question and answer to wrap it up here. There's a lot of natural tendencies both in the United States and Europe to say, yeah, there was a coup attempt, but how does it affect us? So I want to start actually first with not politics here in DC, but politics in Brussels, where before this there was obviously something going. There was a lot going on with the EU refugee deal. How do you look at sort of the post-coup attempt with the Purges with all the cynicism that's going on in the different European capitals about the future of Turkish EU accession, is there one? And what about the EU refugee deal?
Mary, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the EU-Turkey accession, I just think that that's a very distant dream. And I think primarily because of what's happened not only on July 15th, but I think in recent years in the way that Erdogan has become much more authoritarian. But I also think that there's, I think there's this aspect where Turkey's gotten to a point where it doesn't really need the EU. And you see the problems that the EU is having on its own. And, Turkey's economy has strengthened. And it's so interesting to me. I remember going to Turkey as a young child and everybody saying, how can we come to America? And now, a lot of my, friends here going to Turkey to start businesses and to be in Turkey because that's really kind of where the promise and the opportunity is. The confidence that Turks have gained over the last 20 years, the startups that they've started, the businesses that they've opened, they have, I think the mentality has changed within Turkey where I think Turks believe that they can actually succeed and they actually don't need to be a part of the European Union. I think that, in recent days, I think this question of, resurrecting the death penalty, and looking very inward, I think is very disturbing. And I think, we just saw last summer the way that the EU reacted with the migration issue and Brexit. Where they had these posters of the Turks are going to descend upon London. I think there's a lot of, internal concern within Europe, but I also think, Turkey's in a different place, and I think, that's just going to be a dance that they'll do, but I don't think there's going to be any serious movement forward.
There isn't any EU accession, and it seems clear that whatever the Europeans want to do with regard to the post-coup crackdown, if they want to make a statement or take any kind of actions with regard to Turkey, it is subject to the implicit Turkish threat to send large numbers of refugees in the direction of Europe. So it strikes me that the Turks have Brussels over a barrel on that issue, especially given the way the politics are playing itself out within European capitals. So I expect that Europe will be outraged by what's happening in Turkey, but will remain relatively mute because they fear that Erdogan will just let the floodgates of Syrian and other refugees come across the borders, something that Europe is manifestly unprepared to do. And the violence in European cities and capitals recently have made it even more a neuralgic issue for the Europeans and European politicians.
Yeah, so let me link these two threads, and these will be my last question before we turn it over to the audience. And this is linking it back to here in D.C., where the number one issue, I think, is how we perceive of Turkey is a sort of the hub or the forward basing for the counter-ISIL, as we call it around here, campaign. And it picks up on what you just said. There's been a lot of uptick in attacks recently, particularly in Europe. And then there's concerns is that the fallout will limit or degrade, to use the word, the American capability to continue to carry out strikes against the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, particularly because Incirlik, the Air Force base where the strikes are coming out, there was components of the coup plotters that came from that base. I mean, obviously that's extremely embarrassing for the counter-ISIL coalition, but also a reflection, I believe, of the fracturing of the Turkish military to the point where officers that are being sent to overlook a key air base where there are American nuclear weapons stored as well rebelled against the state. So I wonder if you could pick up on that thread. What will this do for the counter-ISIL coalition? How should the United States view Turkey as a partner? You spoke about it a little bit, but I wonder if you can expand a little bit about how this will affect both the border security and the broader mission more broadly.
Well, I think there's really two issues when it comes to the United States. And the first is this counter-ISIL campaign, the issue that has essentially eaten American foreign policy, and the prism through which we view everything. And I go back to this question of the capacities of the Turks right now. Can they continue to control the border? What is the capacity of the military? What is the status of Incirlik? Look, the Turks surrounded the base, cut off the power. in order to go after the commander of the base, the Turkish commander of the base, who was implicated in the coup attempt. But also it struck many as an implicit reminder to the United States that our operations out of Incirlik are actually subject to Turkish government approval. You realize that up until last July, the Turks restricted American operations there to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And only after a very long year of very difficult negotiations did the Turks allow the United States and coalition forces to use the base as it's currently being used. So it raises a question in the minds of Americans, American commanders, others, how long they can use, how long they'll be able to use that asset, and how effective the Turks will be partners in a variety of other things. And then there's the kind of broader issue of U.S.-Turkey relations, which is extraordinarily eye-opening to when you think about how the pro-government press has fingered the United States as being directly involved in the coup. Directly involved in the coup. Individuals in the United States, and not just government officials, people like us, implicated in the coup attempt, which is dangerous, which has put people under threat. But the suggestion that the Yeni Shafak newspaper, Daily Sabah, that the United States tried to kill Erdogan, that the United States is in cahoots with Fethullah Gulen, is not lost on either people outside of government or inside of government, and speaks to the kind of quality of the relationship, which has always been a difficult one, but is likely to be even more difficult going forward. The days of the phone calls between President Obama and then Prime Minister Erdogan are long gone, but I think that this underlines the difficulties in the relationship that the government and its affiliated propagandists want to drive home the idea that the United States was directly involved and that they derive political benefit from it speaks to the quality, I should say, diplomatically, of the U.S.-Turkey relationship.
Anything to add?
I mean, I can add something positive. Sure. I think, in terms of U.S.-Turkey relations, or even or Turkey-EU relations, I think, going back to the economy, the EU is Turkey's largest trading partner, and so Turkey's not going to risk that because its economy depends on that. But there are also a lot of Turkey depends on its economic relationship with the United States too. And so it's not just political, but I know that in terms of startups, 3 universities in Turkey are opening up innovation centers here in the United States, 2 in Silicon Valley, 1 in New York City. I was just Thursday, I was in Boston talking about US-Turkey innovation and the relations there, and TÜBİTAK, which is the Turkish science and entrepreneurship and technology office, has announced a lot of funding between these two, particularly Silicon Valley and Turkey. And I think that they do care about that. And I think there is an element of the Turkish government where they want to see that progress develop.
Well, thank you very much. This concludes sort of my Q&A with our 2 panelists. I'd like to turn it over to the audience with a caveat that, I know a lot of people want to say a lot of things probably about what happened and probably want to respond to some of the things said up here, but questions end in question marks and are usually brief, less than 2 minutes in how they're stated. So with that, I will be a sharp moderator in cutting off sort of soliloquies about how you personally feel about the U.S.-Turkey relationship or anything more broadly. So with that, please, let's turn it over to the audience. I didn't mean to stifle questions. I won't be that mean. Anybody?
Hi, thank you very much for everything that you had to say. Actually, it was very enlightening. My question is, there's conversations going on about a pathway to citizenship for Syrian refugees. in Turkey. Could you touch a little bit on that and how it might be affected with the current situation post-coup, and the implications for maybe what that would mean for Erdogan and the AK party in general? Thank you.
Well, the suggestion was raised in the week before the coup, and it was greeted unhappily by large numbers of Turks. I can't imagine at this moment them going forward on that issue by any stretch. So I think, at least for the moment, while the Turks are cleaning house and restructuring the government and purging people, I think those kinds of issues and other issues related to Syria and other things, important foreign policy and things and cooperative things that Turkey is working on with the United States, are unlikely to happen anytime soon.
I can pick up on there because it's something that I'm interested, because I think it's something more broad. I agree with Stephen in that I think the mechanisms of state through the bureaucracy, I think, are in for some tough times, because things will completely start to slow down. Not only do you have what's going on, people who are suspected of being implicated in this, losing their jobs, or at least being asked to resign or put on forced suspension. For those that remain, there's also a chilling effect in place about how do you operate within a system that's under a lot of pressure and where everybody is sort of under suspicion for, were you or were you not in favor of what took place last week? And so if you build on the sort of Syrian refugee issue, at the time, public opinion polls put it, I think, at over 85% of Turks who said absolutely not to this. But we all believed sort of the power of Erdogan to rally his supporters could push it over the goal line, at least in the ways that it was being advertised, a small number at high level of education levels for these Syrians. And if we are reliant upon Erdogan to push it over the goal line, which I think we all are, he has a lot of other stuff on his mind at the moment. And so I think a lot of these issues, up and down the Turkish bureaucracy, because of the centralized decision-making that was already in place, will be pushed. And so a lot of these things will lose importance as the country begins to deal with the fallout after last Saturday. And maybe you can introduce yourself as well. I forgot to make that announcement.
Hi, my name is Martin. I am from the School of Advanced International Studies. My question is, so in the past couple of days, we've seen, we've read at least about the purges that you talked about, and I mean, they're really disheartening, and thousands of coup prisoners are being raped, as Amnesty International reported. Just today I saw that something like 60 children, like 14-year-old children, are being imprisoned and are denied access to to talk to their parents, and et cetera, et cetera. So I guess my question is, can the European Union, can the EU or Washington or the United States do something to actually kind of, I guess, do they have some leverage to change this thing, and how are they going to respond to all this?
Yeah, I mean, they can do something. Will they is another.
Yeah, and so what can they do?
Well, they can, talk to Turkey about the blatant violations of human rights, not upholding rule of law, silencing journalists, unjustly jailing people. But there's also a lot of domestic politics involved in this, and I think it's a question of whether they will. And I have very serious doubts. As Stephen talked about, the migration deal that Brussels struck with Ankara, and essentially, Europe doesn't want the migrants. And this gives Ankara and Erdogan leverage. And certainly in an election year, I highly doubt that Washington is going to be in a position to start wagging its finger and doing anything to Turkey on any of these issues.
Let me just say that there's all kinds of reports that are coming out of Turkey, both in favor of and against this group or that group, and we need to handle these things with a lot of care. As I said, when it comes to pointing fingers at the coup plotters, let's produce clear and convincing evidence of who is culpable, in the same way that these reports about rape and children being held, these things need to be verified. I'm not saying that they haven't happened, but these are things that I think in this very unsettled environment, very contentious environment, people want to use against each other. So let's step back and make sure that these things are actually happening. All that's a way of saying, though, that if things like this are happening, if human rights violations are happening, people are being jailed unjustly, people are being purged, what is it that the United States can do? First, this administration has, for a variety of reasons that are important to them, preferred to handle their criticism of the Turkish government in a private manner. From their perspective, this has worked for them in the past and has set the relationship, made a better tone for the relationship, and one can expect that they will continue to do that. Secondly, let's also understand that to the extent that the Turkish government, the Turkish leader, opponents of President Erdogan define the current struggle in Turkey in existential terms, it's very, very little any outside power, no matter how prestigious, the prestigious office of the President of the United States can do to alter their interests and their calculations because they believe that they are fighting for their lives. Fourth, I think I'm up to four, it could be three, maybe it's D. The Turks have leverage over us. Like I said before, Incirlik is important to operations against the Islamic State. Of course, before they gave us the permission to use it, in the way we're now using it, we were able to drop bombs on ISIS positions. However, it is an extraordinary asset, and it is subject to their approval the way we use it. And I think that in the broad scheme of things, when we are thinking about what has been termed as a kind of generational struggle against the extremism and worldview that the Islamic State represents, it's unlikely that the US government is going to want to take steps that's going to risk an asset like the Incirlik Air Base. That doesn't mean, it doesn't rankle people that the Turks have been implying that it is a chip that they can use against the United States. It doesn't diminish the fact that the Turks have been largely irresponsible in fingering the United States for this. But that's the current situation, and it makes it extraordinarily difficult for the United States to take the kind of action that I think people would like, and quite frankly, based on reports that, to my mind, have yet to be verified.
Over there, sir.
Tom Olson. Can we talk a little bit more about Hizmet? I read somewhere that they have 150 schools in the United States. Is that number accurate? It was probably in the New York Times.
That sounds right.
It sounds right.
They also had a cultural event at the DAR a few months ago, which they seem to have every year somewhere, and they brought it back to the United States. And they bring all the countries of, I think it's called the Turkic Alliance, all these countries that are Turkic from the old Soviet Union. And they have schools in those countries. To this event, which I happened to go to, they brought a number of American congressmen who talked about how Erdogan was not a very nice guy and how the U.S. ought to support the Hizmet movement. So they're political, they have a lot of schools. My question is, how do they finance all this stuff?
That's a good question.
great
A lot of
question.
people want to know that.
In part through these schools.
Yeah.
In part through these schools, and that is a
Yeah, they're charter
schools.
They're charter
They're
paid for charter schools.
And they're not just in the United States, they're all over the former Soviet Union and other
Balkans.
places. And this is actually part of the genesis of the falling out between Erdogan and Fethullah Gulen, is that when the fallout began, Erdogan sought to close Gulenist schools within Turkey, which was intended to hit the Gulen movement where it hurts, in the wallet. The Gulen movement has been quite active here in Washington, D.C., as has been the AKP and other Turkish groups. I always joke that it's amazing to me that the Turks play out their domestic political dramas here in Washington, D.C., somehow believing that we have a decisive impact on what's going on in Turkey. And I think the events of the last week are clear that we don't. And let me underline once again that to the extent that all of these different groups have defined the struggle in the highest stakes, where the United States government, congressmen who may not like Erdogan, are going to have very little impact on what happens in Turkey.
Yeah, I have to say, I think people make a little bit too much about Hizmet and the Gulen movement. I mean, they're, again, like going back to this point, I think, people in Turkey want some social outlet and they want social progress. And I think Hizmet offers one element of that. But I also think that within Turkey, people are just looking for that, and they're looking for the opportunity to advance themselves. And I think when we break it down into, Gülenist or AKP or any of these prisms, it's not very helpful, because I think Turkey is a much more complex society than that. And I think we're giving too much credit to the Gülenists. I actually, do they play a role in Turkish politics? Absolutely. But, to the extent that, Turkey is a country of 80 million people, and it has so many different factors in it that I think the fear that we have of the Gülen and the Hizmet movement, I think, is a little overblown.
The gentleman in the front.
Thank you, Irv Chapman. I'd like to ask Ms. Bearsley, back when Erdogan was first running for re-election and playing the Muslim heartland card, people, boomers and millennials in Istanbul who go down the street looking as international as you do, were fearful that they would face fear not for political reasons, but for being secular, that they would be discriminated against. Now that he is the president and consolidating his power all over again, is there any similar fear that he's going to play the Islamist card and further make life difficult for internationally minded young Turks?
I think that this is, I think we get in the West, we paint this, this prism of, it's the Islamists versus the secularists. I mean, I take a little bit of a different view of it. I think it's the underclass versus the elite in Turkey. And you've heard Erdogan on a number of occasions talk about how he's a black Turk. He's not a white Turk from the elite. He's not privileged. He's from Kasımpaşa, which is this scrappy neighborhood in Istanbul. He's a soccer player. He represents the common man. And when he first came to power, it was very much this message of, I'm the anti-establishment. I'm going to speak for those who have never had voices in Turkey. And he did. He actually brought up those individuals who were always marginalized within Turkish society. And now, there's this question of, is secularism at risk? I think there is a lot of discrimination. I've certainly encountered it, and I think that there is that, but I'm not necessarily sure it's religious in nature. I think it's much more, again, with these camps that you have in Turkey with, I'm for Erdogan or I'm against Erdogan, and I think that until we can actually create an environment where we have tolerance, respect, and trust, I think it's going to continue that way.
Let me just put it in a different way. I think the problem in Turkey is not Islamist secularists, it's authoritarianism. It's authoritarianism and it's illiberalism. And the problems or the fears of cosmopolitan, Western-oriented young Turks living in Istanbul is really a fear of a new class that has emerged and has become powerful at the expense of what had been a traditional secularist, Kemalist ruling elite. And I think that's deeply unsettling, this kind of change. Suddenly women in a headscarf are showing up in places that they'd never been before. But that's not an indication that Turkey's more religious. It just means that one of the important achievements of the Justice and Development Party is providing an opportunity for Turks to explore their identities, and including their religious identities, in ways that they were never able to do before safely. And speaking of this underclass, this black Turk versus white Turk kind of thing, I remember I referenced this big pro-Erdogan rally that I went to during the Gezi Park protests, and one of the things that struck me, I have a picture of it, of a young man holding a sign, young man, meaning like my age, because I still think of myself as young, holding a sign that said, today is our day, Turkey. Now that could have just been, someone who was feeling very strongly about his being Turkey, but what it said to me really was, it's our day. It's our supporters of the AKP. It's that underclass, those people from Kayseri, the new middle class that has emerged during the AKP period, that it was their day to exercise power, and they were unabashedly proud of that moment.
Hi, thank you for your great remarks, and I really appreciate the fact that you made the distinction that this isn't an Islamist problem. My question is, in light of what you just said and explained, if we look at Egypt, which is sort of a mirror image of what's happened in Turkey,
Thanks, Jenny.
only that the roles have been reversed, how sustainable is this repression? I mean, in Egypt, look, we're how many years away from the last coup? How sustainable is this? And it seems to me that, unlike Egypt, as you explained, Steve, Turkey has an additional problem, which is that it can't really repress the middle class. I mean, because that's what the rising middle class, particularly the younger generation, is responsible for its success anyway, because its success was so reliant upon its economic progress, which of course was never the case in Egypt. So how sustainable is this, and how do you think the Turkish government is going to deal with the fact that its opponents are its resources for success? Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. It's always nice to compare Turkey and Egypt, which has been bread and butter for me for quite some time. How sustainable is the repression is an empirical question. When we think about Abdel Fattah Sisi in Egypt, would anybody have ever imagined that, we're talking about now past 3 years since the coup, and a kind of really staggering amount of violence and repression applied to Egyptian society, yet they continue to do it and continue to actually have a reservoir of support for it. I think that, if you want to put it this way, somewhat of an advantage that the Turks have over their Egyptian counterparts is that you do have a situation in which large numbers of Turks mirroring the Egyptians who supported and support the counter-coup. They didn't want to live under, where you had thousands upon millions of Egyptians, the largest protest in the history of humanity, we were told, on the end of June and beginning of July 2013, welcoming the military back. You had far less numbers in Turkey coming out into the streets, but still significant numbers of people out in the streets, and since that time demonstrating that they don't want to live under military rule. To the extent that either Erdogan or Sisi can frame the narrative in a specific way that keeps the country on a metaphorical war footing, they can do it. Sisi has done that by basically restructuring and rethinking what it means to be Egyptian. Egyptian identity, Egyptian nationalism, and so on and so forth. That has completely written the Muslim Brotherhood out. The Muslim Brotherhood is an alien terrorist organization, and that has been something that has been an important mechanism of political mobilization. In a similar kind of way, Gulenists are playing that role in Turkey right now. And to the extent that people don't want to live under, didn't want the military to intervene, don't think of themselves as a country where militaries intervene, and to the extent that, as both Aaron and Elmira pointed out, the Gulenists, people are ambivalent about a crackdown on the Gulenists, I think it's something that they can continue for quite some time. Erdogan does have the middle class in the same way that Sisi has a much smaller middle class in Egypt. So I think it's an empirical question how long but I think longer than we might suspect.
Just to answer, I think a better comparison for Turkey isn't Egypt, but it's China. And I think where,
I can't do that comparison.
Well, so I think you're talking about a middle class. I think that here is where, I think the government's going to have to decide. You can grab this power and you can repress, but like in China, unless you're delivering for the people and you're delivering those services and you're keeping the economy going, there will be a rebellion. And Turks will not stand for it, and they will come out because they have progressed. And I think just like individuals anywhere, they want to have prosperity, and that's actually what they're after.
We're running short. We have about 10 minutes left, so we're going to take 3 questions clustered. We'll go with that, and then you can wrap up with some final remarks. Maybe we'll start over there with Steve. sorry, and raise your, over here, and he's next, and then right there.
Even before the coup, Erdogan seemed to be recalibrating his policy towards Syria. And I just wanted to ask you to comment on what you saw coming in terms of Turkey's Syria policy.
This gentleman's right here in the blue shirt next to the red. Right there.
Thank you. Thank you for the enlightening remarks. I'm curious as to whether you guys think that the outcome of the coup has anything to say about Kemalism. Is it dead? Is it anything more than a rhetorical weapon to be deployed by political parties? What are your thoughts?
Thank you for your remarks. My question is, why now? Why did the coup happen now? And what led to, it seems as though there was a miscalculation. It seems as though even the military didn't fully support this coup. It was mostly mid-level officers and not higher-ranking officers, and they certainly didn't have the amount of public support that they would need for it to be successful. So why did they decide to do it now? And what led to that misunderstanding or miscalculation?
And then the final in the roundup, we have one from Twitter. So we'll give a shout out to our Twitter followers here on the Allied Council.
So we have a few questions from Twitter. You can take your pick. I want to give our followers the opportunity to ask their questions. Number one, how do you think the coup attempt will impact the Turkish government's relationships with the Kurds? Number two, can you talk a little bit about how significant social media was in the response to the coup? And third, if there's time or you wish to answer, could you address Turkish rapprochement with Israel and Russia leading up to the coup and any effects that is having now?
So that's 7 questions in 7 minutes. That's easy, right?
Yeah,
Sure.
I can do that.
Piece of cake.
First, the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to punt the Syria question to Aaron.
That's what I was going to do.
On Kemalism is dead, and it's been dead for a while. This one of the things, and I'll loop this into this, the third question about why now and why did it fail and why was there a miscalculation. Turkish society, as I think Almira's remarks indicate, my own remarks about politics indicate, is much more complex than it once was. And Kemalism requires a kind of drab political conformity that Turks no longer respond to and no longer want to respond to. And that is one of the things, again, about the AKP's approach that has allowed Turks to explore their identities in ways that they were never able to before, has been part of its political success, in addition to infrastructure and healthcare and all the kinds of pocketbook issues that the Justice and Development Party has been able to deliver. The fact that Kemalism is dead and Turks are no longer really willing to submit in that way, I think underlines the point that I was making earlier about the officers who tried to carry out this coup did not understand how much Turkish society has changed. Much of that may have to do with the fact that Turkish military officers have essentially been military officers since they were 14 years old and have been socialized and educated in very kind of specific ways to think about themselves and the society which they are duty-bound to protect. And I think they probably didn't have a clear idea. Of course, there were careerists who were interested in advancing their career. There were allegedly Gulenists who were worried about a purge and so on and so forth. But overall, I think that there is this disconnect between a military that has been set aside from society and their ability to actually read what's going on there. As to the other questions, I'll just pick and choose. And I'll just say one thing about the social media. I just think it was an astonishing irony that Erdogan used FaceTime and that social media has been important. Erdogan, who has railed against social media, called Twitter Satan, I think. It railed against him, has employed an army, a literal army of Twitter trolls to intimidate folks like ourselves when we dare criticize, that he used social media essentially to help rescue his presidency and his life in ways. And finally, on it's too long. We don't have enough time to talk about Turkey, Israel, and Russia. I think, though, that speaking, going back to what Amira said about Turkey being weak, I think the changes in the relationships between Ankara and Jerusalem and Ankara and Moscow speak to Turkey's weakness in the region and really no place else for the Turks to go but to start repairing relations with the important capitals that do drive events in the Middle East. But that's an entirely different we can come back to the Atlantic Council next week for another session on that.
The quick question on the Kurds, unfortunately, I think the Kurds really come out bad. I think it wasn't going in a good direction anyway, but I think that we're going to see a lot more hostilities increase in the southeast, I think. I don't know what more I can add to that. In terms of the social media, I teach a class at NYU called Foreign Policy in the Time of the Internet, and we take a look at Tahrir Square and the role that Twitter and Facebook play.
Was I an influencer? No, I don't think so.
I think social media not only played a big role in the coup, as Stephen talked about, Erdogan, the irony of, clamping down on not only Twitter, but shutting down YouTube, and shutting down a lot of social media sites in Turkey, dissenting voices, that it did play a big role in terms of getting Erdogan's message out. But I also think with people just communicating in general, I think you can, if you go onto the internet, you can see, I think Bellingcat has a recap of the WhatsApp messages that were traded between the coup plotters. I think these devices and technology has really changed the game, and I'm not sure, how they would have actually conducted it if it didn't exist. I also think that the fact that you do have social media, it's the one outlet that an ordinary Turk does have. And it's so critical to keep that important, and I think that because of the importance of that Erdogan understands that he's always coming out and threatening to silence that.
I will end by actually addressing these because I have my own thoughts about the social media issue. The crackdown on social media has made every single Turk I know a user of torrent that allows them to bypass when they throttle the internet to slow down these things. So in addition to Erdogan FaceTiming, efforts to crack down or throttle the internet on the part of the coup plotters, Turks just flip on the torrent and then just continue on with their life. There's not even a drop any longer in social media usage, and that's a direct result from when they've cracked down on social media in the past and everybody has to bypass it. The only people I know who were affected by the throttling of the internet were Americans who don't spend very much time in Turkey, who happened to be there, and who didn't have a torrent already downloaded before they went. And that's Turkey 101. As for the relationship with the Kurds, there's an opportunity if the AKP wants to play it. And it's that all of that stuff, because I will say up until 2:59 and 59 seconds DC time on Friday, the feeling within the Turkish military and the Turkish intelligence services was triumphant. They thought they were winning their war against the PKK in the southeast, and that they were on the right track to force concessions or coerce the PKK into following certain demands that they have put in place to resume resume peace talks. The issue I was being told was the politics weren't right to begin it again. Well, now the military is in complete disarray. Officers have been, the military, and particularly the combatant command that was in charge of this, the Second Army, lost its leader. He's now in handcuffs, allegedly part of the coup plot. And you have talk amongst senior Turkish officials that, well, these incidents that the Kurds, particularly PKK supporters, take as problems of the state, we're going to look at them again because maybe they were Gulenist officers who carried these out. So there is a pathway if both parties want to go back to the peace process. And just an anecdote, Cizre, this town on the border that is basically leveled in the recent fighting, even those Kurds came out to protest against what was going on in Istanbul and Ankara, even though those people do not, in my personal opinion, are not happy with the state or the military. And then finally, for Syria, again, the commander of the Second Army who's responsible for Syria is now in handcuffs. And the sort of impulses to try and tone down some elements of the Syria policy. Not all that much. I think a little too much has been reported about that, but willing to accept sort of a U.S. timetable for a transition with Assad, I think will be firmly entrenched inside Turkey. With that, those are my concluding remarks. Anything you'd like to say in 15 seconds before we wrap up here?
Thanks, all of you, for coming.
Thank you.
And again, thank you everybody for coming, and please help me thank the panelists too.